I think it's a real decision for a couple to make around what kinds of things they are communicating about while they're separated due to a deployment. Um, and because the other kinds of things that are probably more important are like just trying to get some positive time and connection together, right? Even trying to like have fun together when you do get to talk in person, or if you can do any video calls or emails, any kind of communication that you may be able to have. I think it's really important to be intentional, because a pitfall is that oftentimes that communication gets kind of it's sort of stunted in that it's just about sort of logistics, and the service member who's deployed can't really help.
Today's episode sponsor is Aditon, creators of Aditon Operations Kit, the military's go-to software for personnel and equipment accountability. AOK goes where you do, any network, anytime, any place. I got to know Aditon's co-founders, James and JJ, several years ago. They are former Army NCOs who have years of experience in the tech industry. They understand that most military jobs aren't performed behind a computer desk. Personnel and operations are distributed, but accountability of property is paramount to making mission. That's where Logi, AOK's equipment management software, comes into play. Formerly known as 92X, Logi is a next generation of equipment management for the military. Logi offers unrivaled features for military teams on the go. Ingest and digitize your primary and sub-hand receipts. Generate and share sub-hand receipts and DA forms with your team in just a few clicks. Capture photos, tags, and notes across your team to build context on the state of equipment. Get easy on-the-go access to critical property records. Logi is custom built for the modern military professional. It gives you your valuable time back so you can get back to the mission at hand at home or in the field. Whether you're doing monthly inventories or preparing for deployment, Logi is your pocket property book, giving you real-time visibility into equipment status and mission readiness. Logi is currently in use across the U.S. Army Special Forces, and it's expanding. For a limited time, listeners of the From the Green Notebook podcast can try out Logi for free. Visit aditonppc.com/FTGN-Logi to get started. That's ADYTONPBC.com/FTGN-LOGE. How do I know what I think until I see what I say?
The Green Notebook, carried by military leaders around the world. Within those pages are sweat, tears, triumphs, and the hard-won lessons of life. Lessons worth sharing. Each week, the team dives into the notebooks of military leaders, business professionals, authors, athletes and coaches, and entertainers to share lessons and help you lead with the best version of yourself.
Welcome to another episode of From the Green Notebook. I'm your host, Joe Byerly, and today we're opening up the Green Notebook of Dr. Galena Rhoades. This episode is super personal for me. When I look back on my career, I spent almost 5 years away from home between deployments, training exercises, TDY trips. And that separation didn't just pull me out of the house. It pulled me out of the daily rhythms of family life. And I'll be honest, I didn't always handle it well. And too often my communication with my wife slipped into quick check-ins or logistics. And I let the world of the deployment take me further away from the world that really mattered. And that's why I'm so glad to have Dr. Rhoades back on the show. She's a researcher and relationship expert whose work has helped countless couples navigate the strain of distance. And after our first episode, I actually heard from some senior leaders who reached out to me and told me her words made them stop and reevaluate how they were showing up at home. So in our conversation, we get into some of the real challenges couples face during a separation, whether it's a couple weeks or a couple months or an entire year. And so we talk about how to keep communication from becoming just logistics and instead to how to make it meaningful, why friendship talk, support talk, and even conflict talk are all essential, and how to bridge the alternate universe of a deployment with life back home. And then finally, what reintegration really looks like, not trying to rewind the clock, but building a new relationship on the same foundation. So, if you have struggled with time apart, or you know someone who has, this episode will hit home. And if you are someone who is gearing up for your first time away from home, I encourage you to listen to this and have very intentional, very deliberate conversations with your spouse before you go. It'll save you a ton of trouble during the deployment, reintegration, and 5, 10, 15 years from now. So grab your green notebooks and please welcome back to the show, Dr. Galena Rhoades.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming back. It's really interesting. People have emailed me and texted me since our last interview. It was a surprise for a lot of people because, most of our topics are leadership, or self-development, not really on relationships. And there've been some people in some very key positions in the military that, like, that particular episode made them stop, pause, and reassess what they were doing with their relationships at home. So I'm really glad that we're getting the opportunity to come back together again and have another conversation.
Good. Well, I'm so glad that you're willing to dig in and talk about this really important topic.
So one of the things, and the reason why I wanted to talk to you was when when my wife and I went through couples counseling in 2020. I remember we were talking to the counselor and, giving our history of our marriage. And, we're talking about the very first year, the first couple of years of marriage, and, got married, had a big church wedding in 2005. And then spring of 2007,
Mhm.
gone during the surge, 13 months. And during that period of time, it wasn't till the tail end of that time where communication was more synchronous. But before that, it would be, I would shoot off an email when I could. I would find a call center when I could. But anyways, we're like describing this to the civilian counselor, and there's like a look of horror on her face as we're talking about, our first couple of years of marriage, these like very important years, and I'm gone for over a year. And so it that was the first time I realized that the life that I had led was so different than so many other people, because in this world, this military world we've been in, everything that we're surrounded by it. We're living in the fish tank. And so it just it didn't feel weird until somebody made that face to me. And so I think that's kind of, I think, where I want to start is, even now we're not doing 15-month, 13, 15-month deployments anymore. We're doing these 9-month rotations overseas. Sometimes people can be gone for longer. But I'd like to just kind of talk about how couples can navigate that when these experiences arise.
Yeah, I really like that you had that experience and that we're starting here, because if you think about where so many relationships are in their own development, when someone, is deployed, is away for a long period of time, given the age of most people as they start their careers in the military, it's early in a relationship, right? It's at the beginning of a relationship when what you're doing is, if you're not married yet, you're sorting out what your future might look like, how committed you are to this person, how much you're wanting to spend time together, all of these like huge decisions, right? And then you add in having to have this kind of separation, right? Even if you are already married, it's at a time when you're most likely, just as was the case for you and your wife, you're setting your life up. You're developing what your routines are going to be like. You're deciding, if you have a choice, where you want to live, how close you want to be to family. You're maybe thinking about having kids. All of these things. There's so much happening in your relationship at that time, which just happens to coincide, given our age, right, of when someone would typically be deployed or maybe separated for a long period of time. And that's really hard, right? I don't know that it's easier later in marriage, but
It's not. I find it actually got harder
mhm,
because now we had kids. We had a lot, like there was a lot more going on. Like it wasn't just my wife being home with her
yeah,
single friends or friends without kids. Like everybody's got kids, everybody has even more responsibilities and obligations and commitments back here,
right.
than they did before, and now more is following on the spouse's shoulders, I think, later in life than would be, um, than would be when you're younger. And then there's, the for the service member being forward, then there's the guilt thing, like, oh man, I'm missing this recital, I'm missing this game, I'm missing, all
This
these
birthday
moments.
party,
Yeah,
all of
yeah,
these
exactly.
milestones. Yeah, that's a good point. It probably doesn't get any easier at any stage in our marriages.
Yeah, and so I want to talk about like things couples. One, I'd like to talk about like potential pitfalls
Mhm.
that couples could run into during these long extended times away. And then next, maybe some things that people could do
Mhm.
to negate the negative effects of these.
Yeah. Well, I think let's talk about communication for a minute during that kind of separation. Because one of the things that I think couples often struggle with when they wind up being separated for that period of time is how they will stay in touch and what kinds of things they want to communicate about, right? So some couples, some military couples may wind up and of course, it depends on where you are and what the options are for communication, and you may not always know that before you head out, right? But I think one of the things that can be hard is for a couple to decide, or maybe they don't really decide, and that's the problem. Are you going to talk about the day to day, right? Like, how much am I, if I'm the spouse at home, how much am I just managing day to day? And I'm only escalating certain decisions when I absolutely need the other person's input, right? Versus like going through a list every day of like, okay, here's what's happening. And, you know, we had to make this change to the schedule, or the water heater went out. Who do you think I should call? Right? I think it's a real decision for a couple to make around what kinds of things they are communicating about while they're separated due to a deployment. Um, and because the other kinds of things that are probably more important are like just trying to get some positive time and connection together, right? Even trying to like have fun together when you do get to talk in person, or if you can do any video calls or emails, any kind of communication that you may be able to have. I think it's really important to be intentional, because a pitfall is that oftentimes that communication gets kind of it's sort of stunted in that it's just about sort of logistics, and the service member who's deployed can't really help, right? Like, you can't call the plumber
Right.
while you're deployed. And another component of that to think about, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this too, Joe, is whether the service member needs that communication for support for what they are experiencing, right? So, is it a time for the service member to rely on the spouse back home for support around, some of the hardships that they may be facing while they're deployed? What are your
Yeah,
thoughts about that? If you think about those kinds of different topics of communication.
I think it's really important. And I think, like, if I could go back to each deployment I went on it, and each deployment was very different. Kind of like I think what we talked about right before is like the communication options available to us. Um, but like if I could, I would say that it would start out it start out the same every time. Like it would be like if we could get the opportunity to talk, we would. And, I miss you, I miss you, I miss you. And then all of a sudden, like, life starts happening. For me, I would start settling into this world that I was getting into. And what looking back now, what I realized was that it's almost like you enter an alternate universe where there's people that you're not normally around 24/7. Well, you're around them 24/7. You start having deeper conversations with people. You start having these experiences with people that you're not having back home. And I remember, and depending on what type of deployment it is, like I remember one time, we're talking about this guy that was beheading people and burying bodies. And I remember I was like 26, 27 years old. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is the stuff I used to watch on TV. And now I'm living a life where I'm having these conversations and we're going to go find, where the burials, all this stuff. And I'm like, this is crazy. But like that was like this alternate universe that didn't come back home with me, like,
Mhm. And you couldn't share with your
right.
wife back home in the limited communication that you had, in part because you couldn't share what you were doing, most likely, but also
Exactly.
you couldn't really share what it was like to be having these experiences, because you're processing it in the moment, right? You're not able to like summarize it neatly, like, here's what I did today, and I had this emotion and this reaction, and
Yeah.
it's all coming at you really fast.
And I think, Dr. Rose, like over time, all of a sudden the communication started changing.
Hmm.
Like I would get so sucked into this alternate reality, this deployed world, um, that, talking to my wife wasn't as important as it was at the beginning. This like the stuff I'm sharing all of a sudden starts lacking substance because I can't really share, what's going on. And so I think like maybe, going back to what you were saying earlier is if like, hey, these are the types of things we'll talk about. And even like throughout the deployment, hey, let's
Hmm.
reassess. Like, is this still something that's worthy of conversation? But I definitely think that over time, because I wasn't deliberate, I didn't have the maturity, I didn't understand, is it that we grew apart
Hmm.
as time went on, and I became more focused on the relationships and the people around me than I did about, what was going on back here.
Well, and I think that makes so much sense that that would naturally happen for everyone, right? Because what you're experiencing, while you're deployed is likely fairly intense, and you're experiencing with people who are very similar to you, who are going through the same experiences, right? So you have these shared experiences. You can talk to them all the time, right? It's not such, mediated communication like you have with your spouse back home. And so it makes so much sense that that would happen, and that in some ways it creates more distance between you and your spouse who's at home, right? And you're just having these wildly different experiences from one another during that time. And I do think that by being more deliberate and intentional, sort of having a meta conversation about what you want to have conversation about. And you're right, that's such a great point that you've got to do that throughout the deployment and kind of reset what your expectations are. And it's also got to match what the communication options are for you at the time.
I think it's like one of those things again that people it's easy for me to talk about now because I did it so many times and I made so many mistakes, that I can go back and look. And I think it's, you know, I remember before our first deployment, a senior leader's spouse told, at the time it was a mostly male unit, told all the wives back here, like, hey, don't tell your husband any bad news, don't tell him anything heavy, because they need to focus on their mission. And
Yeah.
what we realized in hindsight was that now the things that my wife could have leaned on me for emotional support for, she wasn't. And it was creating, again, it was like on the other side of it was creating more distance and creating a gulf between us that we didn't even realize until much later what was forming.
Yeah, I think that's really common advice that people get, like don't share any bad news, right? Don't rely on the service member to make decisions, or and I don't know that that works for every couple. I think in some cases it creates an emotional distance and disconnect where you're no longer relying on one another for support, right? And so I think it makes sense to be really intentional about that and think about, in our book, Fighting for Your Marriage, and in our prep program for couples, we talk about there being three different kinds of talk. There's friendship talk, right? Where you're just talking like friends and talking about things that you're interested in or people that you're interested in. There's support talk, where you may need to rely on one another for support for something that's happening kind of outside of your relationship, maybe at work, with other friends or family, that kind of thing. And there's conflict talk, right? Where you need to work something out, you need to make a decision together, maybe you're upset about something that happened in your relationship. And so if we think about translating those to a deployment, I'm kind of interested in what you think. What do you think is most important to focus on? And is it possible to have those kinds of talk, all three of them, while you're separated?
I think it is. And I think, like, again, you're deploying with people, so you're going to have people issues. This was my problem. Was I thought because we were separated, not she didn't understand the personalities of the people that I was over there with. I quit sharing those things, and so all of our conversations became logistics talks,
Mm-hmm.
not really friendship talks, not really support talks. And again, like, gulf widened over time. And so I do think you can have all three in one form of another. And I think it's with the intent, knowing that if you don't, that a gulf will develop over time if you're not careful.
I think that's right. And I think even if you think about each of those types of talk, the reasons why each of them would fall off, right? Like the advice that you got was basically don't have any conflict talk. Like don't bring up anything that's bad or hard, because it's going to, just cause spillover and make it harder for the service member to focus and do their job, which is very important. Um, but if you're not having all three of those in some way, I think you're right. It just means you're left with, okay, well, this happened and I got this fixed, or so and so is going through this. You're just sort of like talking about logistics and updating one another rather than truly connecting, right? So there may be some ways that a couple can focus on having each of those kinds of talk, and I think especially the friendship talk is important, and you have to be pretty deliberate, right? Because you got to be able to like bring up things that are sort of outside the scope of daily logistics, or even things, that are hard, but you got to be able to just talk like friends. Like, did you read about this in the news? Did you hear this happened? What do you think about such and such, right? It's like you need some prompts to be able to have those kinds of conversations that we have when we're talking as friends.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And going back to conflict, I think one of the things that you really don't appreciate is, here, if there's a conflict, like, we're under the same roof. And so we can have the talk, we can get upset with each other, but at the end of the day, like, we're going to be passing each other in the kitchen, upstairs, whatever. Like, you've got to make up and be nice. And I think one of the challenges is because either through text messages, that could be misconstrued sometimes, like people not understanding the tone,
Mhm.
or if you're able to do a FaceTime or whatever, you can get upset with each other and then hit click, and then you don't have to see the other person. And so a lot of times those, like, the disagreements or whatever can get a lot worse than they would be if you were back here. And you've got these people that you're now deployed with, that you're around all the time, that now you're having the friendship talks, you're having the support talks with. And
Right.
it just creates, it just doesn't, there's easier alternatives to
Mhm.
having a conflict talk and resolving that conflict talk with your spouse back home.
Right. It's much easier to escape, withdraw, right? To leave that behind and focus on what's right in front of you. Right. And then you add in the safety component, right? You like your spouse back home, you end a conflict over text and you don't talk to one another for maybe several days because you can't, or maybe because you're avoiding. But your spouse is probably also worried about whether you're safe and, what's happening for you. Like it just adds all of these extra layers of challenge when you're not able to resolve something well and put in that effort. There's this rule that we use in our field that is that you have to have at least five positives for every negative. So, and I think it's probably more like 20 positives for every negative interaction, right? And that's really hard when you're deployed to think about like how many positive interactions you need to have to sustain what could be a negative interaction, maybe around logistics or something else that's coming up that's kind of a conflict. And how do you do those when you're not seeing one another every day, right? Like a hug is a great positive interaction to have, right? Easy, takes just a second. But what can you do when you're deployed to have those kinds of positive interactions so that they provide a buffer for when you do have harder conversations or have to work out something that you might disagree about?
I'd like to introduce you to our newest partner, Roger Bank, a modern digital military bank built by military members for military members. Whether you're stationed stateside or overseas, Roger is designed to meet the unique needs of our men and women in uniform. I recently opened an account myself, and the process was incredibly smooth. It took less than 10 minutes from start to finish. Now, here's why I'm excited to partner with Roger. They offer high yield checking and savings accounts, zero account fees, early payday, and automatic savings with Roundup Match. Their military ready direct deposit form is even auto populated and signed by the CEO, saving you time and hassle. Plus, you get free global ATM access, real person customer support, and they even offer accounts for service members as young as 17. Funds are FDIC insured through Citizens Bank of Edmond, so you can bank with confidence and peace of mind. Visit roger.bank to learn more. That's ROGER.bank. How would you approach that? Like if I was coming to it for advice, like I'm about to go on a deployment, I know we're going to have conflict. Like how would you suggest that, when I do have a negative interaction, that I'm able to get those five positives in when we're not under the same roof?
Well, I think the best approach is a preventative approach, right? To go into it really thinking about what are some ways that we can just build up as many positives as we can during this deployment, right? And I don't think it means avoiding the negatives necessarily, right? You got to be intentional about when you're bringing up something that could be hard or upsetting to discuss. But I would say that we got to have those conversations, right? Like while you're at work deployed, you got to also be putting in some of that work, both of you, toward your relationship. So maybe it's things like, let's talk for a minute about what kinds of communication today might be possible while someone's deployed. What kinds of things do you think, might be possible in terms of communication today?
I mean, we have you have text messages. You have the opportunity for FaceTime or some sort of Zoom, some sort of video platform. There's things like Snapchat out there. You can send snaps back and forth. I mean, really, it's everything. I think everything is available that would be if we lived, 5 doors down from each other. It's everything but the physical aspect.
Hmm.
And so I do think there's a lot of opportunity
Hmm.
there. It's just a matter of like, so here's something that I'm curious about, and this is something I ran into. So if people are listening to this and they're like, you're an asshole, then like I'm sorry, but like I would have a long day, working like 19, 20-hour days. I get back to the room and it was almost like I knew I needed to check in and call home, but I was already showing up to the FaceTime call, or sometimes I just didn't want to FaceTime. I just wanted to text. I didn't feel like engaging, because like again, previous deployments, like the communication opportunities were so scarce. But then by my third one, like it was, almost constant. And so
Right.
like I felt like it was almost like sometimes I didn't want to talk, and then we would finally have a conversation, and it was like it just wasn't great because I wasn't showing up. So I mean, like, is it possible too to have those conversations of like maybe we don't talk every day, or like maybe setting boundaries up without each other having hurt feelings around it?
Yeah, and I wonder for you, Joe, what do you think that was? Like what if I can ask, what felt hard about connecting at the end of a long day?
I think it was because there was a couple of things. One, I had gotten to a point where I had completely shifted into this alternate universe. Like I had finally gotten over the grief of leaving everybody behind. I was fully immersed in it. And I had friends, I had people hung out with. I had a purpose, and so I was like almost completely enamored or entangled in this new universe, and it started feeling like a chore to reach back over time. And again, it's something I regret because the relationship ended up suffering because of it. Um, but that became a thing. And then the other aspect of it was airtime. So if I come back, it's late. I need to get to bed in like 20, 30 minutes. And one of us takes up more airtime, than the other with what's going on. Either say so much that she doesn't get the opportunity to share, or vice versa. It like we just didn't know how to communicate these things.
Yep. So in part it was that it felt like you were getting like pulled back into
Yes.
this other world, and you had, as you said, I think this makes so much sense. You had kind of gotten through the grief and maybe the guilt of not being there. And yet when you get sucked back in, all those feelings come back as well, right? So it might
Yes.
make you feel bad, and you might have more you have to take care of, right? Like you're spent after a day, 19, 20 hours of work, right? Um, and so I think one of the ways to prevent that from happening is to think about different types of talk, right? And maybe communicate about that and be able to say, like, I'm super spent tonight. Let's just like say something nice to one another, right? Like
Oh
maybe
yeah.
just saying like, I love you tonight, unless one of you really needs to connect about something specific. Maybe it's telling you that you love each other. Maybe you take a selfie and send it to one another, right? Maybe you send something funny to one another, right? Thinking about like a good list of things that you can do that lead to at least a moment of positive connection may be really important and more important than talking through what'd you do today, how'd you feel about everything, or this is happening, or how do we solve this logistics issue, but actually trying to make those positive connections. And I almost wonder if that is what the more experienced wife, when you were first being deployed, was suggesting, or maybe a better nuance to that, is that it's not about avoiding what could be negatives or challenges, because I think you have to talk about those things at times to stay connected, but to really be sure that you're focusing on positives and connections that are positive with one another, right? And I think we have so many more tools to do that today, right? Like you can send text messages, you know, as much as like, I could complain about what Snapchat means for my teenagers. I think in this context, it's also a really nice way to like, you're just sending a snapshot of what you're doing today, right? Like, or you got a funny filter on, right? Like there is a way to use those tools for positives and staying positively connected.
Yeah, and I wish, and again, I like just hearing you talk, like for me, I was focused on like, okay, like just the tool. Like I have to communicate, spot, this is my wife, like I need to check in every day, whatever. But what we didn't have a deliberate conversation about was the substance of the conversations. And you're right, like there's even more now. Like yeah, I think like we were on Instagram back then, I don't know, but like even now, like we send funny reels to each other like throughout the day, and like that could be something positive that you do to stay connected. Something else too, I'm wondering is like that I didn't appreciate is the like experience golf too. So like when you deploy, where you were having shared experiences up until the point you leave, now all of a sudden your life's happening on two different train tracks with all sorts of experiences. So how, like, and I guess it goes back to communication, like how do couples navigate that?
Yeah, I think that's such a great point that, one of the things that's hard is just that, you are having vastly different daily lives, right? And it's not like you leave in the morning and you each go to your respective jobs and you come home at night and you talk about this and that happened and spend the evening together. They are vastly different jobs and days that you are having. And as a service member who's deployed, you may be in very intense situations, right? You may be in situations where your life is threatened. You may be working many, many, many hours. There's such an intensity to what you're experiencing, and your spouse at home may be having some intensity of their own, managing household and parenting, perhaps on their own, but not to the same, like, to your core, potentially traumatic experiences as part of that. So I think part of what happens in that is something that you said is which is we naturally sort of gravitate to people who have shared experiences with us, right? And so um, you want to debrief with the people who were there to at the same time, right? There today with you as you went through this experience. And there'd be a lot to catch up your spouse on and some things that you can't tell them about because you have to keep it secret, right? About maybe what your mission is or what you're working on. And so I think that can cause a lot of challenges for people. And I think one is just being aware of that and knowing going into it that that's going to be an experience or different experiences that you have, and thinking about ways to stay connected throughout that, right? And maybe it's possible to every couple of weeks schedule a longer conversation where you talk at a deeper level about how you're doing and process with one another. Or maybe you decide, we're not going to do that, or we're not going to do that for the second half of deployment. But focusing on those shared points of connection, and it takes a lot of work to do that, right? Because as you were pointing out, I think part of your process as someone is deployed, you have to separate in your own mind, which means sort of pulling away in some ways. And I think that is it's a natural process, but we have to find some other ways to then stay connected.
Yeah, there's a book called Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. It's a fictional account of the Battle of Thermopylae with the Spartans. But there's a scene in the book that I read before my first deployment. And the way it worked was that the Spartans would have these like bracelets that they carried, and they essentially like untwined them, and they would keep one with them, and they would put one in a basket, and then the one in the basket had their name etched on them, almost like ancient dog tags, and they were called tickets. And so the personnel person for the army, after a battle, would take the basket up, call out the names, and each person would reconnect their bracelets. And then whatever tickets were left in the basket were either missing in action or, had been killed. And so this king is giving the speech, King Leonidas, and he's saying, "Hey, for those of you that are experiencing battle for the first time, you're overcome by emotion right now. You see like the most fierce warriors around you, like breaking down, crying, being brought to a knee." And he goes, "What happens is when you take that ticket and put that in the basket, that is the part of you that holds your wife and holds your kids dear. That's the part of you that sings out at church." And he's like, "The part that goes into battle with you is the part that can slay another human, that can, unleash violence on people." And he goes, "If you don't separate those, you can't do that job." And so I read that as a, 24, 25-year-old, guy. And so that's how I deployed, is I would separate myself when I deployed to be able to focus on the job at hand. But what I realized now looking back and, through couples counseling, was that in doing that, I also, created distance, mental, emotional distance, which was not helpful at all, for the marriage. So I think it's definitely something. While yes, you have to, I think, separate what you do overseas versus what you do, back home. I also think there's an emotional component there. You got to kind of work out, maybe discuss beforehand.
I really love that analogy and that like that visual of this bracelet, right? And I wonder if in today's world, what's a little different is that you have the opportunity to
Mm.
reconnect your ticket, right? Like regularly,
Wow.
right?
Yes.
So as you went out for your first deployment, 13 months, I think you said, you left the other half of that bracelet like at home, right? And for 13 months, they were separated, those two parts, right? And then as you came back is when you were trying to reconnect them. But with today's communication options, and this may actually, I think, be better for us, just individually and
Yes.
relationally,
Yes.
right? Is maybe we have to think about reconnecting those every day or every
Mm.
opportunity that we have to communicate, right? And to think about how to integrate those experiences much more flexibly than like before to after the deployment. And and it's probably better for us as both the spouse who's at home, but also the service member to not feel so removed from what's happening and this other half of yourself. It's probably the part of yourself that you like more, even, right? That is less complicated than the one that you're taking with you out into battle or into deployment in this case. So I wonder if there's a way to think about that metaphor, but doing that every time you connect with your spouse back home.
Yeah, I think that's great. And again, everything's in hindsight as far as, to stay connected, because I think it makes the reintegration aspect
Mhm.
much easier, and it keeps the relationship warm, when you can't go hot, because you're physically separated. And something else too, that I think a lot of people know about, maybe not necessarily talk about, until you experience it and see it firsthand. But another aspect of this is, I think, because you are in this alternate universe or this alternate reality, you separated yourself. from your spouse, from your support network back home, is that you also inadvertently, if you're not deliberate, you open the door to letting down emotional boundaries in in these deployed environments, which then can create all sorts of other issues for you if again you're not aware of them.
Right. I think that that is really important to recognize that is really common, that you wind up getting close to people who you're deployed with, right? And you're going through intense experiences together. And it's almost, I'm going to use the word false. That might be too strong, but it's almost a false connection because it's not so much built on your whole self being part of this experience, right? But it is based on these intense experiences that you are sharing with someone else while you're deployed, right? Or other people as a larger group that you're experiencing when you're deployed. And we see that happening in lots of different scenarios, right? Like you are in a car accident with a friend, you're going to be more connected to that friend because you went through this traumatic experience together than had you not gone through that, right? Or with strangers who you meet in some kind of crisis, right? There's sort of a natural bond, but it's a little bit of a false bond because it's based on these external experiences rather than you really fully showing up to that potential relationship. And, obviously that kind of like closeness with other people during a deployment is probably not going to feel great to your spouse, right? That you're not able to share those experiences together. And it may make it hard to reintegrate again when you're back, right? And you're operating in a very different world again.
Yeah, and I love that you said that at the very end because I remember coming back from Afghanistan and I didn't want to let go of my friendships and close relationships I had over there. Um, but at the same time, that was dividing my focus from reintegrating here. And I can't tell you how many stories I've heard over the years as I talk to people who, people would deploy, they think they found the one, this person that like maybe they could spend the rest of their life with. People that have potentially thought about like rebooting their life and starting over with this other person, and then they redeploy and something happens like all
Hmm.
of a sudden the rosy colored glasses aren't so rosy anymore. And I think like I've never met anybody where maybe the friendship sustained, but it evolved over time, but like that intensity was never the same after that.
Hmm. There's some research showing that people are more likely to fall in love when they're in a slightly scary situation with someone. So whether that, in this study, it was like standing on a bridge, right, is just a little bit scary enough that it makes you slightly more attracted to someone than if you're not standing on a bridge, right? And I think, I mean, here's this example is just that in such a heightened way, right? And I think that that's just human nature that we want to connect and connect with people who are close to us physically. But what we can do during a deployment is really be intentional about positive ways to connect and make sure that um, we're not letting go of those most important relationships to us back at home.
Yeah, again, I think it's something that a lot of people don't talk about, but it happens all the time. And so, if we were to go back and rewind this conversation and pull out kind of the, I guess, like the central thread through it all is this idea of being intentional and being deliberate. Just like we talked about in the last interview, when you're together, it's the same thing. I think deployed. It's just I don't know that people go into it with the intentionality that's required because that is such a major strain on a
Mhm.
relationship.
I think that's right. And I do think, there are so many more opportunities today for positive communication when we're not physically in the same place, right? To be able to stay connected and be sure that we're doing that work for our relationships.
What about what this is something else too is talking about homecoming now, talking about coming back and reintegrating. Again, for at the time and almost each and every time, it was just a matter of like coming back and trying to pick up where we left off. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think because of that, like people end up, even in my own case, like ended up like creating conflict because of the time apart and what needs to take place to successfully reintegrate.
Well, it makes so much sense, right? That it's going to be a difficult transition for so many reasons, right? I mean, you're getting used to a whole new world again, just personally, right? Where you're making food for yourself, you're taking care of kids and pets, and driving a regular car, and you're not worried about your safety every day in the same way that you might be in different deployments. And so it's a huge transition, and it's such a huge transition for your relationship too, right? It's a transition for both of you personally, but for your relationship, I think there's a way to be similarly intentional about the ways you're communicating and interacting, and recognize that first seeing one another after a long deployment, right? You've got expectations about what that very moment is like. You're going to run across, you're going to trip into one another's arms or whatever that looks like. And then what? Right? There's just so much more that happens after that. And, you're going to look different to one another. There's so many changes that you can go through in just a few months' time, let alone, over a year. And so I think, again, being really intentional about building the relationship, and that it's going to be different. It's not going back to where you left off because so much has happened for each of you, right? But building a new relationship that has the same strong foundation as its basis, I think, is the most important part of that.
Would you say that recognizing that, I think like what you just said of that, hey, things are going to be different. It's going to take work. You're going to have to put time in would make things better. Cause I wonder if it's the expectation factor. Like you said, like you build up an expectation in your mind that this is going to be easy. You're going to run across the field and give each other a hug. And then everything's going to be awesome. After that, it's going to be like the honeymoon all over again. And I think when like those things don't happen, all of a sudden, like you start wondering like, well, what's wrong with us? What's wrong with me? And then like the things, and then the reintegration aspect from, coming home, like, man, I just lived in a tent with 50 people for 9 months or whatever. Like, okay, like there's some aftershocks of that. But I think, recognizing that it's going to be hard, there are going to be challenges, and that we have to be intentional about it. I wonder if that could help lower the expectations a little bit and not create
Absolutely.
as much conflict.
Right. And not create as much concern when that happens, right? Like you're saying, like, okay, what does this mean about me? Do I have to make a different choice? Is there something really wrong with me, with us? But to recognize like there's just going to be some growing pains, right? As you're transitioning to what life looks like after those experiences.
Well, if we were to say, hey, like if if you were to give like a one sheet, like save yourself some trouble from, the deployment to the reintegration. I'm just trying to kind of recap some of the things that we talked about today. So one is understanding what methods of communication are available to us when a spouse deploys. Two would say, what type of communication do we want to have while we're gone? Are we, talk about conflict, talk about friendship, talk about support, and
Mhm.
then maybe even looking at using the different tools that are out there to stay connected, whether it's sending snaps, sending reels. That we talked about the last episode, the Agape app. I checked it out. I think that was awesome. Like one question a day that you
Mhm.
have to answer to get to know each other a little bit better. Again, something a little bit more structured than allowing the conversation just to turn into a I feel obligated. Here's a logistical one. And then reassess constantly.
Mhm.
Like, are we talking too much? Are we not talking enough? And let's do like a deep dive every 2 weeks or something. Would that be, do you think that'd
I think
be
that's a great summary. Write that down and send it to every service member before they deploy.
right? And then let's the redeployment is, hey, like set expectation that it's going to be hard. And one of my favorite books of all time is The Odyssey. And there's this awesome scene at the end where Penelope and Odysseus finally connect after being apart for 2 decades. And one of the things that Odysseus says is basically like, now the real work's begun.
Yeah.
Like this isn't the end. This is where the work starts. So I think like recognizing that and just knowing that like there's been a bunch of people that have gone through it, everybody's had challenges with it, and we may not talk about it openly, so there's no perfect couples, and like this is going to be hard, but we need to approach it with the same intentionality that we got through this deployment with.
I think that's exactly right. And, I love the reference to the Odyssey. That's also one of my favorite books. And, you know, um, and hopefully your dog Argos is there waiting for you when you come home.
One other question, like we were, just to kind of get it back up, is sometimes, and we were like, I think we were about to end on a positive note, but this just popped in my head, so I have to ask while I have you. Sometimes I found this in my own, is resentment starts like boiling, at some level, like either resentment that the spouse is deployed and one of the, family members is left having to do all the work, or the spouse who's deployed like can't be back there doing all the things, and there's like that guilt, and then as a result like the resentment develops. What advice would you give to couples if they maybe they not want to admit it, but they start feeling it while being separated?
Yeah, I think that it's got to be so common that that happens. And I like that you're tying together guilt and resentment because oftentimes our first feeling is actually guilt, which leads us to anger and resentment.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's important to recognize. And I think what's key in that is saying it, right? Like recognizing what that feels like and then being able to communicate it kindly, right? Like, this is coming up for me and let's talk about it because I don't want to feel this way. I don't feel like it's fair that I feel this way. What can we change so that I don't feel this way? And I wonder if you're feeling this way too, right? You can ask that as a question. But I think that's really the key is to be able to say it and talk it through with your spouse.
Well, Dr. Rhoades, thank you so much again for coming back on the show. This was an amazing conversation, and I think it's a really hard one because again, a lot of couples don't sit around, at restaurants or the dinner table with each other and say, "Yeah, like that was really hard," and we almost failed and fell apart. So I think, hopefully this episode, people listening to it can, if they're a newer couple facing their first deployment, or an older couple going on their third, fourth, fifth deployment, that going into it they can be a little bit more intentional now, and set themselves up for success, making it through and reintegrating back.
So I really appreciate you bringing these issues up and giving people the space to think about them and hopefully communicate about them with one another.
Well, if folks are interested in your work and want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
We have a new book out that's called Fighting for Your Marriage. So fightingforyourmarriage.com is a good place to start. And I'm easy to Google search Galena Rhoades. We've got a website for the Institute for Relationship Science at the University of Denver. And I run a nonprofit in Denver called Thriving Families as well.
Well, thank you so much again. This is awesome. I recommend Fighting for Your Marriage. It's like a field manual for being happily married. And if you want to check it out, check out our last interview that we did just a few months ago. And the title of that episode is called Fighting for Your Marriage. So again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks a lot, Joe.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of From the Green Notebook podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and the opportunity to help more people on their leadership journey. Also, make sure you check out our website at www.fromthegreennotebook.com. There, you can listen to past episodes, read leadership articles written by military leaders from around the world. You can sign up for our monthly reading list email where you can learn about new books that are coming out, and our Sunday reflection email that comes out every Sunday morning. Is really short. It's a 2-minute read, but I guarantee you it's going to start your week off on the right foot. Finally, make sure you follow us on Twitter at FTGN Notebook, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for From the Green Notebook. Again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. I am humbled by the opportunity to learn these lessons alongside you. So please join us next week for another episode of From the Green Notebook, where we're going to help you lead with the best version of yourself.
I came from the mud. There's